In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was trapped under a heavy, suffocating heat. The weather was only a small part of the local misery. A long string of failed harvests had drained the city's food supplies, leaving the population to struggle through the daily reality of starvation. This famine was compounded by a new biological threat. Syphilis was spreading unchecked through the citizenry, adding a horrifying layer of disease to an already desperate situation. By July, Strasbourg was reaching the threshold of what a human community can collectively endure. When the mind is forced to process a reality this bleak for too long, the internal strain eventually forces a physical break. The people of Strasbourg weren't just suffering, they were a collective psychological powder keg. All it took was one specific trigger to set off a citywide collapse. That trigger arrived in mid-July, when a woman named Frau Troffea stepped out of her house and onto the cobblestones. Without music or celebration, she began to twist and leap in a frantic, disjointed rhythm. She continued the movement for nearly a week. She danced until her clothes were soaked with sweat, and her feet began to bleed, driven by a deep compulsion, ignoring the limits of human exhaustion. Local authorities eventually intervened, using the logic of the time. They placed her in a wagon and sent her to a mountain shrine, hoping religious intervention would provide a cure. But removing the woman didn't stop the movement. Her highly public breakdown had already established a specific physical pattern that other residents, crushed by the same local traumas, soon began to follow. This map shows how quickly the compulsion moved. It started with 3 citizens, but within days, 34 people abandoned their lives to join the involuntary dance. By August, the crisis reached 400 people, all convulsing simultaneously in the city's public squares. There was no joy in this gathering. Witnesses described the dancers weeping and begging for mercy, visibly terrified as they lost control of their bodies. Physicians called in by the city council ruled out the supernatural. Instead, they diagnosed the crowd with hot blood, a condition they believed had literally overheated the victims' brains. The decision to treat this as a purely blood-based illness rather than a psychological collapse led the city to adopt a strategy that would only make the crisis more lethal. Following the hot blood theory, the council decided the dancers needed to sweat the illness out of their systems. They cleared the local grain markets and built massive wooden stages in the town center to give the afflicted more room. They hired professional musicians to play day and night, and employed strongmen to physically prop up the dancers who were on the verge of collapsing. This created a devastating psychological feedback loop. Treating the dancing as a public spectacle fueled collective panic, worsening the victims' physical symptoms. The constant music and stages validated the hysteria, drawing even more people into the frenzy. Under the scorching sun, human bodies began to fail. Dancers suffered from strokes and heart attacks, and at the height of the plague, it was estimated that 15 people were dying every single day. The government's attempt to manage the crisis had turned a mass psychological breakdown into a mass casualty event. Finally recognizing their mistake, the city council reversed its policy. They banned public music, dismantled the stages, and began transporting the survivors to mountaintop shrines for prayer. By removing the audience and the auditory triggers, the authorities finally broke the feedback loop. Without the public reinforcement, the dancing slowly came to a halt. Modern investigators initially looked for biological causes. One theory suggests ergotism, poisoning from a psychotropic mold found on damp rye bread, which can cause hallucinations and spasms. However, ergot also severely restricts blood flow to the limbs. Biologically, it is impossible for someone suffering from ergotism to dance for days on end without their extremities becoming gangrenous. Historians and psychologists now point to a different diagnosis: mass psychogenic illness. This condition occurs when intense environmental stress is paired with a visual catalyst.
In 1518 Strasbourg, the famine and disease provided the stress, and Frau Troffea provided the catalyst. The dancing functioned as a physical outlet for the city's built-up agony, allowing the citizens of Strasbourg to externalize a level of despair that could no longer be contained by the mind alone. The tragedy remains a haunting reminder of the power of the human brain. When a society is pushed past the limits of what is endurable, the mind will find its own way to break.